Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Saturday morning and this very special session of dtalks. I'm your host, Mashood Bhatt. When we talk about meeting the goals of SDG 4 and the goals which the National Education Policy has outlined with the clear missions in front of us, especially with respect to the foundational learning, it is very also important to understand what the role of the non-governmental sector is. In India, as we are aware, that many non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, and foundations are playing a leadership role in collaboration with the government to implement large-scale educational programs. And the national education policy has also seen a very pivotal role for the non-governmental sector in supporting the government to achieve the dream of every child being able to fulfill their maximum potential through education. But to achieve the outcomes that we are envisioning, it is very important that these strong visions are also complemented with strong leadership and strong management skills as well. And it is very important to also then discuss that for all the professionals and the institutions and the organizations that are working in the social development sector, especially in the area of SDG 4, how can we ensure that such organizations are able to bring out the very best out of their individual workforces so as to kind of channelize the energies towards achieving the goals of the NEP and SDG 4? And to speak on this, we have a very illustrious personality today. He is the founder of the Indian School of Development Management. It is, as we are aware, it has been a pioneering school with respect to capacity building of development sector professionals. Our speaker today has also been the head of education leadership and management at the Azim Premji University Foundation. And has also had a very illustrious career in the corporate sector before being a thought leader in the development sector as well. So it's an absolute honor for us to welcome Mr. Ravi Sreedharan. Raviji, thank you so much for finding time today and for joining us on the dtalks. We are very excited and eager to and looking forward to your presentation and your thoughts.
Can I start, Mashood?
Yes, Raviji, please. You may start, please. We are looking forward to your thoughts.
Thank you so much, and good day to everyone who has joined this call, or probably listens to this even at a later point in time. I do want to first thank Sunita Gandhi ji and the team behind Global Dreams and Devi Sanstha for not only inviting me to this series, but also for organizing these talks and building the narrative around reaching every last child. Working on societal issues at scale in sustained ways is what I'm passionate about. And I feel like I'm in the right group here today. So let me talk for about, 15, 20 minutes, and then, we can have an interactive session. Let me start by saying the obvious, which is that all societal problems must be analyzed in its context. And the solutions need to be thought through and planned, keeping this context in mind. And you realize the importance of these two lines that I just said throughout my talk. So what is the context of working on in the field of SDG 4 in India? SDG 4 is about education. So let's look at the context, right? So no country in the world has ever seen so many children in their schooling system. And never again is this likely to happen, even in India, because there is this huge bulge in our population chart, which is in the age group of 15 to 25, and this bubble is slowly moving up. As all of you know, India has the youngest population in the world, and that's why that bubble is the reason for that. You probably know that there are 265 million children in our schools, which is larger than most countries in the world, and possibly I mean, these numbers are anybody's guess, another 25, 26 million who are out of school. And this out of school number, by the way, is likely to double as per a UNESCO report during this pandemic and this horrible pandemic that all of us are going through. These children, right, these 260 million children will go on to become adults in the next 15 years. That's an average of about 20 million young children going on to become adults every year for about 20 years. And I don't think I need to tell you that the education system as it exists today, and all of us are part of this, has been letting our children down very, very badly. ASA reports have said it year after year that, 56% of class 8 students can't do basic maths, 27% can't read, and so on and so forth. And this number, by the way, according to a recent report by Azim Premji University, during the pandemic would have got much worse. Maybe it's now 75% who can't do this basic stuff. They've lost their learning sort of thread and forgotten a lot of things that they've learned. And the fact is also that besides learning levels being low, we are also aware that our system is very rote-based and really not developing all the basic things that it takes to become an empowered adult and a good citizen. Critical thinking, problem solving, learning to learn, because the future is not going to be what we are teaching today, and so on, are totally lacking in our education system. So what does that mean? 20 million people are going to become adults every year without the benefit of good education. The poor education these children are getting is going to turn into what many have been thinking and calling it a demographic dividend, possibly into a demographic curse. We really have a national emergency on our hands. This is really a ticking time bomb, and will let the country down, not for the next 5 years or 10 years, but for the next 40, 50 years, because these are the adults who will be part of the citizenry in the next 40, 50 years. Corona, having caused unbelievable devastation, will hopefully subside in 2 years' time. But this malaise of poor education system is going to haunt us for the next 50 years. Thereby, SDG 4 is among the most important and possibly most complex problems for us to address as a country. And I say this while recognizing the other SDGs, the other 16 of them are also all important, and we cannot solve one SDG at the expense of the other. And that's something I completely recognize, but education is really at the heart of the solution, or, the problem as it stands today. Let me try and now explain the complexity of the system, right? I mean, the problem that all of us are working on SDG 4 are trying to solve or improve is not only large, but it's super urgent, and it's very complex too. India has 1.5 million schools, over 8.7 million primary and secondary teachers, and about 260 children enrolled. We are home to the largest and most complex education system in the world. And if you thought these numbers itself are complex, it's just the tip of the iceberg. The complexity gets more complicated when you realize that more than 19,500 languages or dialects are spoken in India as per the last census. There are 121 languages spoken by more than 10,000 people. And out of 100 students that enroll at the start of a school, 29% of them drop out before even completing elementary education. And we all know that most of them are from the most marginalized communities in the country. And by the way, these numbers have got much worse during COVID, and we haven't yet seen the bottom of that impact. How many children are going to be out of school by the end of the pandemic? Could be 2x, 3x, or even 4x of what the numbers are currently. And of course, during COVID, digital became a huge enabler for whatever limited education we could offer. This has now exposed the huge digital divide in the country. In fact, in a survey done by the Ministry of Rural Development, they found that only 47% of Indian households receive electricity for even 12 hours in a day. And more than 36% of the schools in India operate without electricity. This clearly suggests that while students from families with better means of living can easily bridge the transition to remote learning, students from underprivileged backgrounds, which is a majority, are likely to succumb to inefficiency, and a lack of adaptation, either because of the inaccessibility of the technology or the low education levels of their siblings and parents to guide them through these tech-savvy applications. So we are working on an incredibly complex problem. And by the way, even if this is not the end of the complexity, because besides these operational challenges and large numbers, every good educationist will tell you that besides working on teachers, curriculum, pedagogy, textbooks, school activities, examinations, classroom method, which are complex enough, school education is also affected by nutrition levels, malnutrition, domestic violence, gender gaps, attitude towards education, the social quotient that schools offer. Every child wants to be sent to an English medium school. Wear a tie and go, that's a great school. During harvest season, children will drop out of the school system because they need to be taken to help with the harvesting process. Children from so many tribes in pretty much half the districts of this country will drop out because they speak a dialect which is laughed on by their peers. So it gets more and more complex as you go down and explore this. Imagine the iceberg called SDG4. Learning levels is just the tip of the iceberg. The iceberg itself is underwater and about 90% of it is below water. And for those of you who come across from the world of business or have a background in finance, the education budget of the country is just under 100,000 crores. It's about 93,000 crores. It came down from 96,000 crores last year, which is approximately in US dollar terms, $13 billion. And mind you, this 13 billion, according to every economist and educationist, is 3 times less than what is recommended for the education in the system in the country. The system should have actually about $40 billion of money for spending in the education sector. So why am I going on and on about this complexity of the challenge in fixing the education system in the country? Well, I want to make the point that there is a critical missing ingredient in the work we're trying to do to fix education, learning levels, etc. And without this ingredient, which in my opinion is how do you manage this whole education system? So you have to do all this. You have to work on books, you have to work on curriculum, you have to work on transfers, you have to work on promotions, you have to work on school, but you need to manage all this. And we'll never ever come close to solving the problems in education if we don't know how to manage this. Managing this huge juggernaut, which needs to operate with incredible agility, because we have to contextualize it to the village, to the clusters, to the blocks, to the districts, to the states, with people working at the state level, people working at the national level. It's a juggernaut that needs to be able to work with a lot of agility. And managing is not just at the top. It's not just the principal secretary sitting in Delhi who's I'm talking about, but across numerous layers, geographies, functions that are involved in education. Technical experts, generalists in the system, and so on and so forth. Unless we are able to fix how are we going to manage, we will never solve the problem. My personal view is there is enough theory and knowledge on what needs to be fixed. The challenge lies in how do we bring it all together? How do we make it work effectively so that every last child is pulled out of the poor quality of education she might be receiving? Just let me try and explain this management to you, right? So the world has a business management cadre, the MBAs, that provides management for businesses. And these businesses have built huge, complicated businesses that operate across the world and reach billions of people across the planet. Facebook, Google, Hilton, Yahoo, you can go on naming it. There are so many of them. And by the way, businesses were not this large all along. It all happened in the last 100, 150 years. Business management, by the way, is about 120 years old. Then you have public administration cadre that provides management for the state. So if you take the 3 pillars of society, Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar, business management for the world of business, public administration for management of the state. And again, they have shown how to lead and manage large countries, $1 trillion, budgets, and cross-border work, across countries, bilateral, multilateral, and work that sometimes cuts across even 200 plus countries. So there is a whole public administration cadre. So what does this management really do? If you go to the sort of meta level of management and understand what is it that management really does? And by management, I'm using the verb management. I said business management for the world of business, public administration for the world of managing the state. So management is very simply about working with large numbers of people, large sums of money, complex processes, building networks and partnerships, strategizing, planning, executing, monitoring, making changes as you go along, influencing people's attitudes and behaviors, designing organizations, creating cultures for great working atmospheres, evaluating performance, creating reward structure, and all the stuff that goes into it. Now, that needs to be done very differently in business. It needs to be done very differently in state. So the way an IAS officer is incentivized cannot be the way a CEO of a business is incentivized. And we need something like this in the social sector, especially if you want to manage such large, complex problems like SDG 4 is trying to work on. Managing education across the country, right? 1.5 million schools, 8.7 million teachers, 260 million enrolled, budget of $13 billion is extremely complex management challenge. There is no cadre of quote unquote education management experts that exist today. And we just try to wing it. And the whole thing falls apart. It's not that we don't know how to train teachers. It's not that we don't know how to build schools. It's not that we don't know how to produce books and reach them to schools on time. The management process is completely collapsed. Forget managing it at the whole education level. I've been to enough schools across this country. Even managing the smallest entity in the education system, right, which is the schools, is in itself a complex management task. I mean, imagine a head teacher working with such limited resources, with diverse stakeholders and aspirations, diverse groups of children, building the right culture at a school, bringing them all together, managing a range of stakeholders, students, teachers, SMCs, parents, BEO, DEO, Panchayat, village education council, then arranging all the required resources on time, day after day, whether it is from the government system, the cluster office, the BEO's office, or from the village, the Panchayat, managing activities in the school, right? Extracurricular activities, midday meals. That's a whole process in itself. Managing the timetable so the teacher is there, the students are able to learn, sequencing it in the right manner so that learning can happen. And all this to make sure that the learning levels of children in the school are achieved. And the overall aims of education are being met. This is a complex leadership and management task. No school leader in this country is trained for management. And by management, I don't mean business management. Let's call this development management. So if we can address the issues of management in education system, I think we will be able to at least give us a chance of solving the challenges of the system at scale and much faster and in sustainable way. And faster is important because remember, 20 million youngsters are going to become adults every year. We all know what needs to be done. We have come up with new education policies time and again, and I've read up some going back to even the late 19th century, and we really don't say anything new. I mean, most of it is around contextualizing for the current environment, the current realities, and the current context. With that, we need to have good teachers, that we need to have teaching rooted in the environment of the child, that it should be child-friendly syllabus and curriculum, that we should lighten the burden on the children so that learning happens, etc., etc. Nothing has changed. The solutions remain the same. The challenge is managing the education system. I have worked across thousands of schools in the country, and I'm yet to see a good school with a bad head teacher. Doesn't happen, doesn't exist. You will never find a good school with a bad head teacher. Good school leadership is a must for good school and for the school to deliver to the aims of education. By the way, before you think I'm recommending that we must flood the schooling system with MBAs, absolute no. I repeat, I would not let the pure play MBAs and techno managers near the schooling system. Why? The approach taken for management in business cannot be used for managing schools and the schooling system. You must remember that business management is a product of the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, humankind figured out how to produce goods in large quantities. The whole production system and standardizing. They needed to know now how to manage these inventories, how to manage the cash flow, how do you manage the working capital, how do you build distribution systems, pricing, competition, so on. That's when business management got created. By the way, business management was originally designed by engineers. Engineers who at that time figured the way to produce goods in large quantities. And the formula was standardizing. This techno-managerial approach, as I call it, cannot work in education. How does one standardize in education? I mean, I have two children, and both of them are so different in their learning methods, so different in terms of what each of them were able to understand at different stages of their life, at different ages. The subject they were good at and they were not good at. The subject they liked and they didn't like. One wants to play music loudly while studying, while the other needs pin drop silence. While one prefers to study at night, the other prefers to study in the morning. And I can go on. The point I want to make is if I can't standardize for the education of two children at home, how are we supposed to standardize education for 260 million and with so much complexity to the backgrounds of each of these children, right? Caste, culture, religion, mindsets, norms, etc. So when we use industrial models for education, we standardize it and we get something like the current schooling system. Think about it, right? Our current schooling system is a classic creation of the industrial model of management. What do? We put children into the production system. They enter in grade 1. After a year, they're all moved into grade 2. After that, all of them are moved into grade 3. This is like a shop floor, right? And they're subjected to the exact same intervention. The class 1 teacher knows what to do in class 1 and will keep doing that. And that's the old model of how do you produce goods in large quantities. And then as you go along, you reject a few defective students at every stage. It's like some parts in manufacturing are defective. I mean, this is the system you've created. It's an industrial system. Now, while this can process large numbers, it doesn't mean it can produce the quality that is required. And this does not take into account so many things we know about learning, development, children, emotions, well-being, etc., etc. So we have to think of management in the context of education. And for that matter, I mean, any work in social change, and at ISDM where I work, we call this development management. And you could argue why you're calling it development management. We won't get into that, but let's for a moment call this development management, and that's what is required. So my life is dedicated around this area, and so when I think about, so how does this management, how is it different from managing schools or the education system, etc., right? We need a management that is rooted in universal human values of fairness, of dignity, of equality. We need management that's rooted in the idea of a desirable society. The preamble of the country talks about what kind of country we aspire for. One that is just, equitable, humane, sustainable. One that recognizes the complex and diverse nature of individual and societal aspirations. You can't reject individual and societal aspirations. They exist. Where a system where one treats human beings as human beings and not as some widgets or resources. One that measures success not just by efficiency and numerical parameters, but also taking into account non-quantitative measures of human development, like the child's confidence, the child's happiness, the respect for diversity, the ability to learn. And one that recognizes that the role of education and the aims of education to be far more than just some instrumental idea like getting them job ready. And let me share some of the characteristics of how is this development management different from business management. What makes it so different? And I'll just take 5-10 minutes on that. The first is that the day I graduated from IIM Ahmedabad and went into business, I was prepared and trained for competing, winning customers, gaining market share, deriving high margins, etc. Development work cannot happen through competition. We have to think collaboration and the basic idea of collective good versus individual good. Very, very critical. If we adopt the same competitive model that you use in business, you will completely fail. You will waste philanthropic money, and the final child or whoever you're trying to work for will not benefit. The second idea in business has always been a unique selling problem, something I know nobody else knows, so I can sell that in large quantities. In the social sector, the management has to be open source. I have to make whatever I do widely available. So every person, every community, every school is able to use it. That's how change will happen at scale. If I go on to the third aspect, right? So it's about how do I produce something that the customer cannot do so and will prefer to pay me for doing that. Whereas in our system, in the social work, It has to be the opposite. We must do something where the participant, I hate to use the word beneficiary, is able to do what you do and eventually do everything that you do. And that should be the method. And that comes out of a belief in the agency of the community. So a management system and process that understands what does it mean to look at participative solutioning rather than just delivering goods and services which only I know to produce. And one other thing I would say is, in business, it's all about value maximization, what I call a stakeholder approach. Whereas in social work, we have to think about it as a human development approach. The whole objective of business management is to maximize value for a defined sort of a group. Whereas in this space, it's all about the entire humankind, right? I mean, there is an HDR report that UNDP has produced. It's a beautiful report about how human development is an important aspect. And it says that the human development approach is about expanding the richness of human life rather than simply the richness of the economy in which human beings live. Yeah, and it's an approach that's focused on creating fair opportunities and choices for all the people. So how do you bring all these ideas together in a human development approach? So if I now bring it all back to the education system, right? I mean, how do we bring development management into the education system? First of all, we need to start believing the idea that you need professional management, which is tailored for the education system, not just borrowing from the world of business or from the world of public administration. And by the way, there are no band-aid solutions for this. Business management has taken 120 years to get where it is. Public administration is 140 years old. But we need more and more people, more and more organizations coming together to work on education, leadership, and management. It had built up, about a decade ago, or 10 to 5 years ago, and that suddenly seems to again be lost. The new education policy doesn't talk two lines about education, leadership, and management. So we have to build the theory and practice of education leader, ELM, right? And we need to start by defining what does ELM mean? How does one go about? What are the qualities you need to be a good professional manager in education? How do we engage the Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar? We need to build and engage existing institutions in ELM. We need first the government. Government has these CMATs in every state, and not a single CMAT is operational. How do we make this flourishing institution that work on leadership and management? How do we get other university systems to engage in leadership and management for education? And we need to build cadres of people. So we need to build a cadre of school leaders. We need to build a cadre of people who run the education system at the block level and the district level and the national level, at the state level and the national level. We need to build a cadre of IAS officers. There isn't a cadre for education. We need to build a cadre of IAS officers. Maybe we call it the Indian Education Service, so that you have professionals who understand the complex nature of education. Otherwise, we can keep spending, doing all the work. 40% of philanthropic money goes into education, billions of dollars, millions of us working in the space. The needle will barely move on the quality of education. That these 20 million people who are going to become adults every year will go out with poor education. So my disruptive submission to all of you is, how do we work in the space of defining and creating the theory and practice for management of the education system? This is super, super critical and completely lacking. Sorry if I took more time than I should, but love to get into a more, listen to others and maybe an interactive session.
Thank you, Raviji, for this really triggering and thought triggering presentation. And I think you've put in spotlight an area which is often not an area of discussion a lot in the general conversations that we are having around learning and education. And it's truly important, like you mentioned, that the system, the ecosystem of education is so large scale, so complex. And the example which you used about teaching kids and standardize anything for 2 kids is something which is so challenging, and we are trying to do this for 10 million children.
Correct.
Getting your thoughts. So one question which you wanted to discuss, and this is something which you have you did talk about in your presentation as well, that there is like a lot of focus these days on kind of bringing in management principles, and borrowing from the business, the corporate sector, and kind of using some of those principles in the social development sector, including education as well. Um, you shared what are some things that we should not be looking at, or these are some things which we should be wary about with respect to competition versus collaboration, and these other aspects. What would be some areas where you think that some of the principles of the corporate and the business sector can be used in areas of education, and which ones would be where we would not, which have not really worked in borrowing from the corporate business sector to development?
Yeah, no, and that's a very important point because this is a question I get asked very often. And sometimes people assume because I am talking, I'm recommending that we apply business management principles, to the social sector. No, I would never recommend that. But are there things we can learn? Without a doubt. And I think that's where your question is a really, really good question. So I've commented quite significantly on this question during the course of my talk. But let me pick the specific question of what we can learn and how to work together, with the world of business maybe and the state. Firstly, let's understand that there is no idea of a best practice. You can't take a practice that has worked there and say, I will bring it here, because the very different purposes the two serve, right? So that's designed for a certain purpose. So if a certain salary reward structure works there, it works there because the purpose it has to achieve is that. You can't take it as it is from there and put it here. You have golden handcuffs there. You can't put golden handcuffs here. We have to first recognize that uh, this direct lifting and so copy pasting nature. That's an important thing to realize. However, the ideas, the underlying ideas that have made the business world work, for themselves, we need to think of how we make that work in the social sector, right? For example, right? The world of business long back has figured that you have to pay to get good talent. We unfortunately live in a world where you have to pay for everything with money, whether it is food, whether it is education, whether it is hospital bills, whether it is whatever you want to do. So, can we pay our teams better? The social sector continues to somewhere believe that no, this is a space for volunteerism and and sacrifice. No, I don't think so. I think we need to know how to pay people better. And unless and until you pay people better, you will not attract the brightest of minds and talent to come and to retain people. I know so many bright youngsters who come into the sector who are my students, and 5 years later are so loving the work and believe in the work, but lamenting the fact that they can't pay bills. And we're not talking about extravagant bills. So, how do you pay is one very big question. The second thing that, and this is a bit of a stretch statement, so I say this with a little bit of salt on that, is somehow the world of business is able to drive a lot more accountability than I would argue we are able to do in the social sector. Now, of course, what does accountability mean has to be seen very differently in the context of the social sector. But I think that ability to constantly keep your finger on the pulse and know whether the needle is moving, whether what you're doing. I think sometimes we fall into what I call an activity trap. And that activity trap is we're all doing good work, lekin dunya to wahi ka wahi hai. And that's very dangerous, right? We have to be conscious ki, is the lever moving, or am I seeing signs of movement, or do I even believe it's moving? That's it. Doesn't have to necessarily be the same metrics I use, which are very numerical in the world of business. But how do you build higher levels of accountability is something that maybe we should think about. And then the third is thereby related to that is performance management system. I am seeing that today the world of NGOs are taking performance management systems from the world of business and putting it here as it is. Whatever it is, balance scorecards, appraisal systems, quarterly targets, etc., etc. And I don't think that is the right way to do it. We have to think of a performance management system for our own system. How do we design performance management where people feel motivated, people feel excited, people are driven by the purpose of the organization that we work? The fourth one I would say is, and this is a big one, can we design better financial management tools and systems for the sector? Our ability to manage finance is pathetic. overall as a sector. We just don't know how to come up with innovative solutions, how to drive, risk capital into the space. How do you open up? That's what the world of business has done. I mean, through creating, for example, a stock exchange, they've released billions of money which are lying in savings accounts and under the pillows of people to work for business. Why are we not able to do that? I know there is discussion of a social stock exchange, but it's really going nowhere. So how do we get into managing our finances better? During COVID, so many NGOs just went under because you had not managed your finances properly. You were not ready for a rainy day like this. So that's another area where I really think, developing financial management tools and systems for better leverage of philanthropic funds is very, very important. And then the last one, this is the big one for me in the recent, decade, if you like, which is that the world of business leverages, new ideas, inventions, discovery, and makes billions of profits and revenues out of it. Whether it is big data, artificial, so all your Google, Yahoo, Amazon, all these big companies, what are they working on? They're working on big data. They're working on artificial intelligence. That's what it is. That is what is at the root of it. Why are we not using it for social change? How do we use the same underlying things, but for social change? How do I improve education using big data, using artificial intelligence, by being able to customize things? Today, I talk to some friend and my mobile phone, Google listens and gives me an ad of something. Why can't I do with the children that, I tailor my education systems in those systems? How do we use all these tools that humankind has discovered? The business is exploiting it and exploiting it to the disadvantage of the weaker sections of society. So can we leverage the latest ideas and inventions of humankind, but for a better society? We're not in the world of making more profits or anything. So technology, big data, knowledge graphs, digital communication, behavior change, and so on and so forth. And the other thing is regarding the collaboration, Mashood, and this is an important one. The starting point for this has to be trust. There is a huge trust deficit between the world of business and civil society. People working in business, by the way, come from the same backgrounds and homes that all of us in the sector have come from. They are not bad people because they work in the world of business. And by the way, we are not good people because we work in the social sector. We have to recognize that these two systems are different and they are driving very different end results. It's not the people who are bad. Thereby, we must engage each other in conversations and dialogues. Today, unfortunately, all of us in the social sector will keep talking to each other and we build an echo chamber for ourselves. The world of business, they talk to each other and they will build an echo chamber for themselves. We have to cross-pollinate. We have to communicate. We have to respect each other. We have to trust each other. The social sector by itself cannot solve all the problems. Samaj, Sarkar, Bazaar has to come together if you want a progressive society. So we have to figure out how do we engage in dialogue? How do we invite more corporate people to such talks? How do we get more government officers to such talks? How do we go and listen to the talks that are happening in the world of business? And we need to build that trust. That trust deficit is very, very serious.
Thank you, Raviji, for sharing your thoughts on that. Another point which you mentioned in your opening presentation was about the pitfalls of standardization, where how the system of the industrial the industrial assembly line system, if we may say, is something which our current education system has kind of borrowed from with respect to grades and standardization. When we talk about national missions, where we are talking about standardized goals, right? So the national mission on foundational literacy talks about standardized goals by this age. This is this class. This is the number of words they should be able to speak. This is the mathematical operations that should be there. And the whole NCRT learning outcome is also about standardization. How do we ensure that when the outcomes are standardized, the approaches to reach those outcomes do not fall face the same pitfalls? And what would be the role of leadership, of education leadership and management in this? Your thoughts, please.
Yeah, and this is really the holy grail, right? How do you achieve results for all, but recognize that each one in that all are different? And that's the key, right? And that's a challenge. I don't think there's an easy answer to that, right? But what we know, for example, worldwide, that standardized testing is a miserable failure. right? Now, those were the old approaches. But today, as the world has reached where it is, and that's the point I'm trying to make, is we've got artificial intelligence. Like I said, you and I are talking right now. My phone is listening to what I'm saying, and Google will give me an ad at the end of this call, right? So we're using it for that. Why am I not using it to understand how is a child doing? How is a child progressing? What is the best way this child is learning as different from a different child? Versus this production system where I will take all the 20 million children in grade one and put them through the exact same process. So it's a question of figuring out. And I think once we start thinking what the human mind is an amazing mind, we will come up with solutions. We will come up. We need to push more philanthropic money into it. So we have to recognize that every child is a human being and human beings are super complex. Businesses are very straightforward. I produce Coca-Cola and I sell it all over the world. you know Teaching a child is not the same. So we have to figure out and accept that. That's the starting point. I don't think there are easy answers to this, but the starting point has to be to recognize that maybe every panchayat should be empowered to run their own school, versus every panchayat in the state has to run exactly the same curriculum and the same three language formula and the same. We need to determine maybe the calendar for a year has to be tailored to, let's say, the weather patterns of that area. During harvest season, maybe the school hours need to be changed. You can't have the same thing across the country. You can't have the same months as the period for study. So there are many things you can do, and there are some easier ones to do, but I don't think there is an easy answer to this. But if you don't recognize this, we can spend another 100 years and we'll be saying the same question, which is to achieve standard results, how do I not have standard operating procedures? We must accept, and I think the world is increasingly moving towards, and businesses have cracked this, into micro customization. How do I customize it down to micro nano levels? And that's very important for us to leverage if you want to create an education system that's truly respectful of every individual human being and aspirations.
Raviji, you also mentioned about the kind of ecosystem of the Samaj Sarkar and Bazaar, right? And especially when the Sarkar, and these are like kind of systems which which have their kind of own unique peculiarities and thermodynamics of how they operate. We see a lot of collaboration in education with these three stakeholders, and how when we bring in the sarkar in this, the bureaucracy in this, we see that their system of, you mentioned about the cadre system, right? So you have these different cadres and a lot of collaborations with respect to NGOs and governments. Often we see in the development sector the grievance that okay, things were going well, and then a senior bureaucrat has been transferred, a decision maker has been transferred, and now you have to start from scratch. So what would your advice be, or what would your thoughts be with respect to what skills and skills need to be developed by leaders in the civil society organization sector to be able to deal with these change of of cadres and change of officials who are at the helm of affairs at the government with respect to education? How do they make their impact sustainable in such a situation?
Yeah. No, this is such a challenge, and so many organizations struggle with this. You would have done 3 years of work, and then, the secretary is moved out, and sub coach, has now been, reduced to nothing, and so on. So, but the answer actually is very simple. While the implementation will require a lot of thinking, the starting point is how do you solve it, right? And I think what we need to do is to recognize that we need to work on strengthening the systems and processes of a good education. It's like we need to work on the GPS system and not the apps that work on the GPS system. A lot of our work is on the apps. None of us are working on the GPS itself. How do you make the GPS, robust? How do you make this GPS work? Like I mentioned, right? We can get the system to define cadres for various. I mean, have we pushed today for an Indian education service? I mean, I'm sure if we kept rallying that, and today increasingly Niti Aayog and the government of India and all are listening to a lot of us, right? Otherwise, today what happens? An IAS officer who has worked, I don't know, in forests or mining for all her life suddenly lands up in the education thing, and you and I are wondering, what am I going to talk to you about? And that person comes up. So we have to work on how do you, for example, create a cadre for that. The second aspect is data. The thing is that when the person moves on, your work should talk, and the ability to demonstrate. And that's the other thing we're not very good at. How do we make evidence-based, data-based decision making? And that's very important, because if you're able to tell the person who's moved out, this is the data of the work that I've done, this is the results of the work we've done, this is the impact that I've done, you have a better chance. Today, we're not great at capturing all that. And the third is this narrative building, right? How do you build a narrative that stays? You don't want a narrative that only influences that person because of that person's characteristics. You want a narrative that is systemic in nature, and thereby it's got a much longer lasting piece of work. And finally, you have to accept that people will move on, and you might have to go. That's part of life. You will have your ups and downs, and that's something we have to. And that happens in the world of business also. One customer will leave, I have to find another customer. Government policy changes, my prices change, oil price will change, and so that anyway we have to accept. But my point is, let's work on the system. Let's work on data. Let's build our narrative. Those are the things that will help us sustain ourselves in the future.
Right. Thank you, Raviji, for sharing your thoughts on that. Um, uh, uh, Another thing, I think another point which you mentioned was about making our systems agile, making our organizations agile and adaptive. And Post the pandemic, of course, this has been put to test with respect to how agile organizations are. And you did mention that many organizations, while of course the whole trinity of Samaj Sarkar Bazaar has been impacted. But in the social development sector, we are seeing that while some organizations have been resilient and have been adaptive, but then some have not been able to be resilient and adaptive. What would your thoughts be with respect to how development sector organizations can build that resilience and adaptability? This is not going to be the last pandemic. This is not going to be the last crisis. What do the leaders of such organizations, what skills do they need to develop to make the organizations resilient?
Yeah, there's this old saying, right, which is strength in unity, or the five fingers in a fist is far more stronger than each of the fingers. That these are all things we've been told by our grandparents and so on and so forth. But when we operate in isolation. It's only during the pandemic, and I'm telling you, I've been in so many conferences in the last 10 years where every NGO leader comes and talks about collaboration. But no collaboration ever happens after we leave that conference. Only during the pandemic we saw collaboration, and fantastic collaboration, right? There are so many collectives of NGOs, with upwards of 150, 200 NGOs coming together, rallying together, doing work on pandemic, directly or indirect effects of pandemic, like livelihoods and education, whatever. The strength lies in being together. If you work in isolation, you will die in isolation. Pardon that very horrible language, right? So even when there is no pandemic, let's build a collaborative. Let's raise money together. Let's then share the money across. You'll raise a lot more money, and you will be sort of there for each other to manage that highs and lows. Today, you're trying to do it alone, and that's why you end up in these situations. So the idea, this thing that I mentioned earlier, right? Collaboration being a very basic ethos of how do you manage in this. In the world of competition in business, I can never collaborate. In fact, actually, there also they collaborate. They'll create a NASCOM, they'll create a FICCI, they'll create a CII or whatever. We don't do that. What is there today? I don't even have a law that protects me from a funder who's told me I will give you 10 crores next year and then doesn't give me the 10 crores. In the world of business, if a customer doesn't pay, he'll be sent to court, he'll be put in jail. Why? Because they've collectively worked the system. So this is the first thing that, we have to figure out, how do we collaborate? How do we work together? The second is this whole, results and impact. No funding will be stopped for somewhere where impact is clearly demonstrated. The problem is not that impact is not happening, but you're not demonstrating. You're not keeping the evidence. You're not, what I was just saying even earlier, that's another important part. I remember in the world of business, one of my bosses from Brazil used to tell me that profit is freedom. तुम profit बनाओ, तुमको कोई कुछ नहीं पूछेगा. In our sector, impact is freedom. If you are demonstrating impact, nobody will ever mess with you. And these are important things to think through in our psyche, and how do we go. And the third is really financial management and good governance, managing of boards. I really think if I had to invest money in strengthening the social sector, I would put a big chunk of it in building the financial management skills of the sector, from fundraising all the way to fund utilization and working through working capital, operating expenditure, capital expenditures, etc. That's an area that we very manage. And the last is governance. We have to know how to manage risk, be aware of the risk, and be able to anticipate and mitigate those risks. And this is something where, by the way, businesses are damn good at. Managers, senior managers like me were paid on how good were we at anticipating a risk and being prepared to handle that risk. That's a very important quality in our sector, because our sector runs much higher risk than the world of business does. Because we are not only putting ourselves at risk, we are also putting millions of people we are supporting at risk. So this whole space of risk management, right? How do you anticipate risk and how do you prepare for that risk? I mean, simple things like, you should have 6 months of runway of funds. You can't be living and running, because you're putting your beneficiaries at risk if you're running it like that. So things like that are very important. And then the last one I find is also with people management. I've seen a lot of organizations which have survived the pandemic, where the teams have actually, taken 50% cuts and things like that on their own, and help the organization to come through this. So if you treat your, teams and employees well during the good time, they will help you come out of these bad times. So people management, financial management, governance, collaboration. These would be some of the tenets of how you can see through the next pandemic. I hope there's no pandemic though.
Right. We hope so too as well. And thank you for sharing your thoughts on this, Raviji. And I actually, it's very interesting where you pointed out that you talked about these coalitions and collaborations in the business corporate sector, right? You mentioned FICCI and CI, etc. And it's for someone who it sounds kind of, for someone in the development sector, it would sound counterintuitive that a sector which is built on high competition and taking market shares is kind of collaborating for an overall benefit of the system. In the social development sector, like you mentioned, that there are now evidences that there has been collaboration post the pandemic. But generally, there is a kind of an unsaid kind of a thing that collaboration would also amount to are the donors of the two organizations willing for such a collaboration, because they might be competitors in their business sector. And also the important point which you mentioned about evidence of impact, right? So if collaboration happens, who takes the credit for that evidence has that impact has also been a deterrent in this sector. What would your thoughts be on do you feel that this is something which is a problem, and if it is, how could that be addressed? Your thoughts,
Yeah.
please.
No, Mashur, this is such a good question that you asked. And if you see, and I plan to write some case studies of the collectives that got formed as a response to the COVID situation, which a lot of us NGOs were in really a tight spot, in the early part of that COVID. But these collectives become so powerful. And if you talk to some of the heads of the executive heads of these collectives, they tell me funds is the easiest thing to do now, because the funders suddenly see strength in this. Wow, you're now going to have impact so much. I don't think people are so worried about this, the smallness of thinking. मैंने किया था, नहीं किया था. And I'll be honest, right? If any person in the sector takes credit for social change, they really don't understand how social change takes place, because it's a far more complex process. If you think education is improved because you and Pratham did work, I'm sorry, you didn't change because of Pratham. There are many factors that go into it. Now you're a catalyst in that process, right? So that mindset has to change of taking credit. The biggest problem, and this is something that I might put myself into a lot of trouble saying this, is that the sector is still very founder-led. And as long as organizations are founder-led, ego becomes a big part of the game. And by the way, businesses were like this. Businesses about 50, 70 years ago were owner-led. And they ran businesses and made business decisions with a lot of ego. No, I need to kill that guy. I need to be better than my cousin brother or whatever. Ego played a very big role. Over time, because of the whole professionalization of management, they realized, no, it's better for the owner to stay back and let the professional manager run it. I'm telling you, the day the social sector makes that transition from founder-led organizations to professional-led organizations, we will see a huge change. Then you'll make far more objective decisions. I'll give you an example, right? Mergers and acquisition happen all the time in the world of business. Social sector में आपने एक merger and acquisition नहीं देखा होगा, because it's very personal. It's an ego thing. Why should I lose credit for the work I'm doing? Versus thinking, no, the child will benefit through better education if I just merge my work into this other organization. No, I'll never do it because I'm very egoistic about it. No, I get a lot of personal joy and satisfaction out of doing it. So it is a complicated process, but I'm telling you, if you don't collaborate, you will die alone. And the other interesting thing, this is the most fascinating thing. You asked about this taking credit and the funders being competitors. Today, funders are collaborating far more than NGOs are collaborating. I mean, the Grow Fund has just been announced, right? It's a huge fund. It's fantastic. It's so powerful. It can achieve a lot. What is it? It's funders who got together, and funders will continue to get together. I can tell you that. And the funny thing is that as funders get together, they will also want larger coming together to address real work. They don't want, tin pot organization working in some small area here, there, and there, where the system is not going to change. So yeah, if funders can collaborate, I mean, I think it's far easier for us. And I'll tell you what, we don't have a choice. You cannot be working in this sector without the spirit of collaboration. Sorry, I'm making very hard statement, but I hope it's useful because this is a disruptive
yes.
talk.
Yes, sir. So surely this is in line with the theme that it is something which these are some important points which and the point which you mentioned about collaboration being something which in every conferences we see that there are people say that okay, no, it's wonderful to collaborate, etc., and they see the truth in what you are saying, that it is also a question of, I mean, you won't be able to survive if there's no collaboration. But then these are certain challenges which come across in the ecosystem, as you did mention, and it's important to address these because these are management and leadership problems which need to be addressed, and it does impact the ultimately the whole system. Here we would like to take one question from the audience as well. So we have a question from Anushri, who is saying, please share your perspectives on conceptualization phase to transition phase by blending ideas of plan into actions for achieving organizational goals. Yeah, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so this is classic management. This is what I mean by management. Management has the ability to understand, do a situation analysis, identify your intervention, design organizational processes so that you achieve the results, right? That end to end, right, from planning, conceptualization to execution and impact is the holy grail of all our work in the social sector. The problem that happens is we are very good in some parts and not at the other part. So for example, I find that in the social sector, we have all the ideas of how to solve the problem. But in the execution, right, the conceptualization is great, but in the planning and execution, we fail miserably. Project management skills, right? The business world is fantastic at project management skills. They produce dashboards like there is no tomorrow. How many of our organizations in the social sector can even put a spreadsheet together that is good enough? We struggle, and I don't mean any disrespect. Mind you, I'm from the sector, and I have immense fascination for the work we do in the sector. But can we bring these skills, project management skills, communication skills, documenting skills, evidence-based skills? This is what transitions from conceptualizing to planning to implementation to impact.
Right. Thank you, Raviji, for answering that question. And it's truly been remarkable to listen to you, because these are these are questions which often do not get discussed in the sector. And here at the dtalks, we essentially have invited a lot of stakeholders from this trinity of Sarkar, Samaj, and the market as well. So the aspect of leadership is something which itself we have invited leaders, but here having a full talk on how leaders need to develop as well and kind of take lead with respect to management, etc., is something which adds a very unique perspective to this forum. So we really appreciate you joining us today and for sharing these very important ideas. And I think for all those who are watching live and who will be watching the video in the coming time as well, as we promote further. This will act as a very important thinking template for individuals, organizations in all these three sectors of the Trinity. So thank you so much, Ravi Sreedharan ji, for joining us today and for sharing your disruptive thoughts on our platform.
Congratulations to all of you, Sunita Gandhi ji, you, everyone else, for making these talks. This is what we need.
Thank you.